Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to this reassessments panel. And I think that we are about ready to begin. So actually, just before we begin, I want to give the usual disclaimer that we are recording this. And in particular, that means we're also recording all of the other panels happening. So if you want to see one that wasn't this one, you can go find it later. But we're planning to post those and the slides so you can review them, and we retain the rights to rebroadcast and distribute those recordings. By participating, you're agreeing that your contributions are part of that recording. For panelists, that's video, and for everybody, it's audio, chat, and the Q&A as well. So welcome to our reassessments panel. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists and then turn it over to them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about how they handle reassessments. And then we will have a lot of time for Q&A. So for everybody attending, you can use the Q&A pane. We generally are not monitoring the chat for questions. So if you have you feel free to chat, but if you want to ask a question for us to see, please use the Q&A pane. And also please remember to change anything you do in chat from all panelists to all panelists and attendees to make sure everyone can see it. All right, with that, I'm going to say we have three panelists, Adelaide Akers, who's currently at Emporia State University, moving in the fall, Jason Elsinger, who's at Florida Southern, and Amy Kassir, who's at the United States Naval Academy. And so I would like to turn this over to Adelaide.
Hi, everyone. I am Adelaide Akers, and I am an assistant professor at Emporia State University. I just finished my third year on the tenure track there. I started standards-based grading straight out of grad school on in my tenure track position, mostly because I had learned about it at Project Next. I had a few colleagues, Tom Mahoney and Chad Wiley, who you met earlier today, who also use mastery grading and were very adamant that I try it. And then also, I just felt like it was the right grading system that I wish that I had had when I was a student. I was the type of student who learned how to game the system and didn't learn as much as I probably should have, which became a challenge when I got to grad school. And so I think in retrospect, this is the type of instruction and grading system that I wish that I'd had when I was a student. So I've adopted it. I've done it in a lot of different ways, which I'll talk through real quickly here. I've used standards-based grading in Calculus 1 and Calculus 2. We had about 25 standards, and when I say we, Tom Mahoney and I helped to develop what those 25 standards were going to be. In Calc 2 and Calc 1, there were about 25 standards each. For Calc 2, Tom and I both taught that at the same time in the spring of 2018, and the spring of 2019, and we felt that reassessments should take place during office hours, that there would only be one attempt per week until after the gateway exam over integration was passed. And then the students would also have 4 exams. So I have exams in quotation marks here because the exams were basically all of the standards that we had covered in class up to that point. And so they basically had a free 2-hour session where they could try to pass as many standards as they wanted to, or not. So that happened 4 times throughout the semester. And I think it's the equivalent of what Kate Owens calls her reassessment carnival. I think that's what she calls it. But it's just a time for students to have an extra attempt at passing standards. In Calc 1 last fall, I made some changes, mostly because I'm a mom of 3 kids and they're young, and I have to sometimes cancel office hours, and it makes it difficult for students to do reassessments. So I decided to work together with our math tutoring lab, where students can drop in at any time when the math tutoring lab is open, and they're open from 8 a.m. to about 10 p.m. During the weekdays. And so I coordinated with them and said, well, why don't I just have students take their reassessment quizzes instead of during my office hours? They take them in the math tutoring lab where they're proctored. They can only do it on Thursdays, and they can do it between the hours of noon and 10 p.m. That would give me some time to make sure I had the reassessment quizzes down in the tutoring lab ready for the students who needed them, and then they can drop in any time during that noon to 10 p.m. period to take it. That helped me out a lot because students who were commuter students could also come in, late if they were, or early if they needed to before they left for work, or students who worked could maybe come in a little bit later and do it, and I didn't necessarily have to be there at 10 p.m. because, again, I've got children. So I still kept with the only one attempt per week until after the gateway exam was passed, and that kind of helped incentivize students to pass their differentiation gateway exam. And then this time I offered 3 exams, and again, that was a sort of assessment carnival for them. In Calc 1, I did something a little bit different than normal to incentivize students to spend some time in between reassessments trying to improve themselves. And in that sense, I required them to do a revision reflection in order to qualify for reassessment. So every assessment was assessed using this pass revise rubric, which I justified here. You can see some specifications here are very broad, but it's overarching. So depending on the type of problem, the exact pass may look a little bit different depending on the correctness or non-correctness. But what I've provided here usually covered all the questions that students had about exactly what was expected for them to pass. Next slide, please. Okay. Specification grading in proof-based classes like discrete math and mathematical proofs and numerical analysis. I used, again, this pass revise rubric that you saw on the previous page. That happened for homework problems, and their homework problems, they would have a certain subset every week, and then I would grade a handful of those, and they would either pass or not pass them. And then at the end of the semester, they would have to pass a certain percentage of the total homework problems offered in order to earn A, B's, C's, or D's in the class. The students were permitted up to 2 resubmissions per week if they did not pass a homework assignment or a homework problem. That was to keep my sanity because grading proofs is intensive, and I wanted to make sure that students had enough opportunities to improve themselves, but I also wasn't grading 1,800 hours a week. And then the last thing I did for this class really was a final portfolio project for the discrete math and mathematical proofs class. And then for numerical analysis, it was just a final project where in the proofs classes, they had to choose out of 12 conjectures, choose 10 to prove or disprove. And then they could submit for review for me at least 2 times per problem. And if you're curious about this system, I stole it 100% from Ted Sundstrom at GVSU. And he has a website that's pretty well dedicated to his portfolio project and how he's structured that in the past. So I'll refer you to that if you have questions there. But you can see here in this table how I structured the bundles for requirements for passing, what is required to pass each one of these categories in order to earn an A, B, C, or D. So this is just kind of an example of how I've employed that.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of clarification questions in the Q&A, and so I think I'll ask those now, and then the broader ones, such as there's a question about students who have accommodations, I will ask all panelists at the end. So Adelaide, right now there's a clarification question. When you say 1 attempt per week, I think it was, does that mean 1 attempt per goal objective, or just 1 per, what is it 1 of?
Right, so it is one standard attempt per week. So they would, let's say I have a standard on calculating limits using limit laws, algebraic limit laws. Then there would be a quiz there for them, and that would be their attempt on that standard. But they would, if they chose that standard to attempt, then they would not be able to attempt any more that week.
And say I've done something very similar. It feels like a severe limitation. It really helps to focus students. There's another question here from Gloria. Do students sign up for the quizzes at the tutoring center? That is, do you know what standards they want to reassess, or how do you manage the logistics of that?
So I required students to send me an email by 5 p.m. on Wednesdays, and they had to state which standard they wanted to attempt. And then I would use Thursday mornings to put together all of the standard quizzes that the students requested. So some students might email and say they want to do the one on limits, limit laws, and then another student might email and say they wanted to attempt the standard on differentiability, on determining the differentiability of a function using a graph. And so I would have to create those, or at least print off those two different quizzes for the number of people who requested them, and then take them down to the tutoring center and leave them for the students to show up and take.
We had one last question, which is, could you say a little bit about what the effective failure assignments are in your bundles?
Sure. It is not really related to reassessments, so I don't want to waste too much time on it. But one of the things I realized in doing some of my classes is that students were very scared of the term fail, because when I first started this, I used a pass-fail rubric instead of pass-revise. And so they were very worried about the word fail. And when I was in Project Next, I was fortunate enough to hear Edward Berger talk as a keynote speaker at one of our Project Next sessions. And he talked about this term effective failure that he uses in his classes. He described it as basically what do students do, or what tools or skills do students need in order to rebound effectively from failure. And so these effective failure assignments that I've created kind of keep students aware and build the skills that they need in order to rebound effectively from failure. A lot of that has to do with creating assignments involving reflections, where students will reflect over the mistakes that they made, and also how they feel about them, how they were able to overcome those maybe depressing feelings and see it as an opportunity to improve instead. So, and those are based off of just like completion. It's mostly, if students invest in it, then they're going to get something from it. And if not, then they don't.
Thank you. And actually, there's one last question, but I want to put this to all panelists just for when you're speaking. If you could say a little bit about the size of your classes, the number of classes you're teaching, anything special about your student body. So just a little bit of context for everybody. Adelaide, could you address that briefly?
Sure. So my undergraduate student class sizes are face-to-face, and the class sizes are anywhere from about 15 to 35. And in my graduate level classes, they're purely online, and they can range anywhere from about 9 to 50.
Thank you. And so we will come back to additional questions after our other panelists speak. And so right now I'd like to introduce Jason Elsinger. Jason, you can take it away.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be on this panel. My name is Jason Elsinger, and I've been using standards-based grading for about 6 years. Currently, I'm at Florida Southern College, which is a small private school. Class sizes are all typically less than 30, and I have a 3-3 load, sometimes 2 preps, sometimes 3 preps. For the last 2 semesters, I've done standards-based grading in all 3 classes. Prior to that, I only did standards-based grading with 1 class. That was typically my upper level class. That was mainly to majors, and a smaller class, maybe less than 20 students. I've also tried standards-based grading with several different classes that I listed here, and also several different student audiences. So initially, as I mentioned, I was doing it mainly with majors, but then I've also tried to incorporate it into general education classes as well, which is namely the elementary statistics class. Notably has no majors in it. We actually have another statistics class that those majors typically take. Next slide, please. So my process of implementing reassessments has been a little different in the majors courses versus in the general education courses. And over several years, my implementation strategy has kind of evolved to essentially having all of them, or almost all of them, be in class, and then I save my office hour assessments for students that really need it. And I'm kind of thinking like the bottom 30%. And I wanted to show you an example of an email I might send to a student that say didn't do well on a recent quiz or an exam or something. Just to reach out and say, listen, we should talk about these. Let's go over it, figure out what happens. And then I think it's key to point out that at a later time, I'd like to offer you a reassessment on those. And I don't do anything until the student responds to this. Sort of the point is to sort of get the students to take the reassessments more seriously, which I think would hopefully increase their success rate and then decrease the need for reassessments later. As I mentioned in the past, when I was doing this with one class, with a smaller class, I've also allowed students to come freely to my office hours anytime that they want. They can just say which assessments they want to take, and I would have sort of papers printed out ahead of time that I could hand out. And for a small class, it works. I have a lot of success stories to the students, but overall, my office hours were a little busier than I would prefer them to be. So that's why I've sort of evolved to kind of having them be more in class as well. Also for that general audience, I can't really have the expectation that they'll come, like all the students will come to my office to do assessments. I really had to shift them to be mostly in class. So each week I'm giving, one day on a Tuesday, Thursday class, or 1 to 2 days on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class for either a shorter reassessment or a whole day for like an exam type assessments. Next slide, please. I listed here a few things that I've been doing that I think have helped make reassessments run more smoothly. And I won't mention them all here, but the first one here is more of a preference for me. I prefer to have students correct minor mistakes to obtain that mastery. So rather than having to do a new problem, I give an asterisk symbol that indicates that there's a correction somewhere. And maybe I'll give a little feedback to indicate like what kind of correction. Do they need to just clear up some of their explanation? Or is there like an arithmetic error? What kind of clerical error it might be? And if they're willing to correct that error, hand it back to me. I let them have mastery for it. They don't have to redo another problem. So that cut back on some of the reassessments of new problems. I've also set limitations, just like I described in office hours. I mainly have it be for email invitations. Here and there, I get some students that'll come by and ask, like, "Oh, can I reassess this?" Tends to be a lot of the students, like the A+ students, those students that are a little eager to reattempt things. And sometimes I let them do it, but then other times I just explain, why I have my limitations in place, and I find my experiences that students understand, and then we can set an expectation for when they can expect to take that reassessment in the future. Something else I do is if a student would like to initiate a reassessment in my office hours, I also require some kind of proof of practice. And again, this is, I've heard other people describe this as well. And I think it's good to help students, again, take the reassessment seriously, just to make sure they're not trying it just for the sake of trying it. And something that I do, I think, especially in the elementary statistics class, which has worked really well for me, that general education audience, is that I stopped doing new material pretty much 2 weeks before the last day of class. And then I save all that time for review and reassessment. So the students are reviewing the whole course, like where they are in particular, what parts of the course they want to focus on. And then I have 2 to 3 exams, like days just dedicated to almost like a final exam, basically. So they have access to any of the learning outcomes. And I find that to be a great way to get at reassessment and get students to where they want to be. So that at the last week of class, students are basically at the grade that they plan to get. I wanted to mention that my experience implementing reassessments and as well as other components of mastery-based grading is kind of detailed more in a paper I wrote recently with Drew Lewis, which can be found on the conference website. I'll link to it.
Thank you very much. As before, we have a few clarification questions and then a few that I'm going to put off until all panelists can respond to them. Let me filter through here quick. One big question I see is, how do you decide which students are invited to resubmit?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So I have a grade book that has also been like an evolving thing. I just add features to. But when you log everybody's assessments, it's pretty clear on with your grade book, like who's sort of falling behind. Or if I grade something and then I put the grades in, I can clearly see which students Maybe if I gave a 2-problem quiz, a student gets like both problems wrong, for example. So I might email, maybe 6 to 8 students, not every single time, but definitely after an exam type bigger assessment. And then sometimes for a quiz, I think if a student does clearly poorly on that, that kind of indicates it. And then I can also see in my gradebook if there is a string of such things. I might reach out to the student a slightly different way just to kind of say, hey, I've noticed you've maybe disconnected with my class a little bit. I just want to check in if there's any difficulties that you're facing. And I find the students are very appreciative of that. And for example, I found out one student had her father passed away, and then, okay, that explains what to do. And then we can make a path moving forward. So I just kind of watch the grades and it's pretty clear.
Great, thank you very much. And as I mentioned, for other questions in the Q&A, we're not ignoring you, but I am saving some of them for later. And so I would like to introduce our next panelist, who is Amy Kazir at the U.S. Naval Academy. Amy.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. I wanted to talk about two different modes that I've used standards-based grading in. Well, I guess one of them is more standards-based and the other one was more specs, sort of combination standards and specs. So the first one was the Introduction to Proofs class. Ours is called Fundamentals of Mathematics, or Fun Math. And I teach all of my courses with inquiry-based learning. So one of the reasons that I like doing standards-based grading or mastery grading is because I think it fits really well with that. And I really like the aspect of giving students it's got the growth mindset piece, and it's got the, giving students more agency over their learning and more control in some ways. So in the Introduction to Proofs class, students were working outside of class on problems, and then they would come in and present their solutions, or they would hand in, if they had solved a problem outside of class, they could hand in that written solution. And so that would be an opportunity for them to earn a credit for one of the standards, and then, rather than sort of having a reassessment thing, it was just that there were lots and lots of problems and they all sort of had some of the standards. And so details about that class are in the article in the Primus special issue that I wrote with my colleagues, Megan Selbach-Allen and Sarah Greenwald and Jill Tomley. And then the other classes that I've done it in are, I've done it in Calculus 1 and 2. And I wanted to just give a shout out for if you want to super save time, Laura Tallman wrote a blog post about the way that she did it. So she put in a lot of time, front-loaded a lot of time doing the programming to write all of her quizzes in LaTeX to generate random quizzes, but then her grading was really fast. So if you prefer programming in LaTeX to grading, then you should, and you haven't seen this before, you should check that out. Okay, next slide, more details. So this was an example from my Fun Math class. So these are just some of the learning targets. The learning targets, I had some that were sort of more process more process things, and some that were more content objectives. So for instance, and this was very complicated, and it was too complicated, just so that you know, but for instance, the learning targets were things like, I'm comfortable using the generic particular to prove universally quantified statements. Well, that's going to come up over and over and over again in this class. So I didn't need to write new problems or whatever. And so then I had this system of ranks where you could become a Padawan or a knight or a master in this skill. And then over on the right-hand side, on the right-hand column, you see what rank do you need to get to earn a C in the course? What rank do you need to be at to earn an A in the course? And then I would sort of, add all those up in sort of like the bundling that people were talking about. So to get an A, you didn't necessarily have to be a master in all of the things. You could be a knight. And I was sort of trying to communicate the idea that this is just your introductory proof class. You're going to get better at this as you go on. So that was sort of the reason that was disconnected from that. So, but like I said, this was a little too complicated. I did have, everybody had I used Google Sheets and shared with everybody, sort of what their tallies were on all of these different things. But most students, it was too complicated for them to really get enough sense of where they were in the class. But anyway, just wanted to give that as an example of something that could be improved. But I liked, there were aspects of it that I did like, that it felt like it really was capturing what I wanted them to be doing to earn particular grades. Okay, next slide. For my calculus classes, most of my things I've assessed using quizzes. And then I also have separately exams, and in the specs grading version, the quizzes were sort of like to earn a grade, you had to get a certain percentage on quizzes and certain percentage on exams, and you had to do certain writing assignments and things like that. So it was a little more complicated, but with the quizzes, the way that I worked reassessments was that there was usually one quiz a week. And so Thursday would be quiz day. And so a quiz would take like half the period. So later on in the semester, I would not schedule anything other than reassessments for the second half of the period. So then if people needed to reassess, they could do that, or they could just hang around and do kind of office hours, ask me questions about stuff. And then I also had, I think the first time I tried to do this, I had people coming in and out of my office like all day, every day. And so I switched to having once a week in the evening, because my students, they all live on campus. They all have very prescribed schedules. Oops. So I knew that in the evening was a time that they could be available. So I would have this usually a 2-hour block once a week, and lots of people would come. Some weeks lots of people would come in, and some weeks not so many. And then for each quiz, I would have a folder, and the folders were different colors to help me find things. So this is my low-tech system I put some pictures of. So there's an example of one of my folders. And then inside the folder, there's a little piece of paper, so that, and the blue page or whatever brightly colored page were to separate version 2, version 3, version 4. And so then I could look on the list and say, is this person ready for version 3? Okay, flip back and give them version 3. And so then when I was grading, I would have to say, I would cross somebody off the version 3 list and either add them to the version 4 list if they needed to take another one, or not. And I limited it to 4 total attempts, again, to keep my grading load down. So that's how I did the quizzes. And then I also had a couple of writing assignments, because there were certain things that I felt like the only way with it that I would know if they really got it was if they would write about it. So for instance, the definition of the derivative, what's that limit as h goes to 0 piece mean? Why is this related to slope? All of that stuff. So so that was one where they would write it, and then if it didn't demonstrate mastery, then they would just have to revise it. So all of my assessments were either, yes, you've got it, or no, not yet. So I think that's all I've got for now.
Great, thank you very much. So I didn't see any specific clarification questions for you, but I believe we'll now go to some overall questions. Before we jumped into that, I wanted to summarize 2 things that I have heard from our panelists and bring in a couple other items as well. One is sort of the variety of ways that you have said when or how you do the reassessments. We heard in class, either paced out regularly, or in periodic exams that sort of cover everything so far. During office hours, in a proctored way involving maybe a tutoring center, and that there's also a distinction in there about revising previous work versus new attempts that address the same standards. So those are sort of the variety of things you might think about for the how. And we've also heard a lot about limits. And so some things that our panelists said, one way to limit the amount of reassessment and limit the amount of time you devote to it is to invite students specifically to do it, to give a limited number of times that students can attempt any reassessment per week, or a limited number per standard or per objective. To use something I think we didn't hear, but to use tokens that students can earn and then spend for reassessments. And then also to use some sort of reflection to ensure that students have put in the time preparing that you would like to. So that covered a variety, may not have covered everything. But here's a variety of questions that I'd like to elevate from the Q&A for all of our panelists. And let's see, let's begin with the big question, and directly related to amount of time. Robert asks, is there a pile of grading to do at the end of a semester? Several exams and a final in some of your cases, or just in the amount of reassessment for others. Does that happen? How do you manage it?
Yeah, if I can, I can respond.
Mm-hmm.
So a few thoughts there on the end of the semester. So I think yes, the last 2 to 3 weeks of the semester, I think you should expect to be a little busier. What I find is typically what happens with partial credit grading is that you give the final and then you have this like rush to grade after the course is over. It's flipped. So all the grading and busyness happens before the final. And then at the final, I'm able to grade it then and there. And then once the class is done, that's it, I'm done. My grades are ready to be inputted. So yes, it is a little is a little busier. And there are certainly things you can do to take more control of that. But overall, it's very worth it. It's very worth it.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to address that?
I can just say, yes, I definitely had a pile at the end of the semester. And the only thing that I've done to help that is that I'll say the last day of classes is the last day that you can do reassessments. And that gives me a couple days before the final exam to finish getting through that pile before the final. Not that I always get through that pile before the final, but in theory.
I strongly recommend that as well, that you want to be nice, but you don't want to be so nice that students are piling things into exam week for you.
I'm gonna third that
please.
as well. I think in the syllabus, in my syllabi, I have like a final date for all resubmissions. So like if finals week starts May 4th, then Friday, May 1st is the very last time I'll ever consider taking reassessments. And that will give me enough time to catch up on grading.
A question about almost the opposite end of things is, early in the class, how do you get your students started with reassessments? I know I always have the experience of students don't quite pick up that they need to be doing these. How do you encourage them to take advantage of them?
Yeah, I think that student buy-in is I suppose a separate topic, but definitely in the background that makes all aspects of mastery grading work smoothly, most likely. So I think having a general understanding across the whole class that how the learning process fits into these reassessments. So what I like to do mainly in the first month of the semester, almost every class, I've heard others talk about this too, where you just take like 5-ish minutes in the beginning of class, and I use that to talk about one specific aspect of mastery grading. And in terms of reassessments, I might describe, say, before handing back a quiz, what students should do when they receive feedback that is not mastery. So first of all, I like to remind students that making mistakes is okay. It's fine to make mistakes, it's expected, and it's part of the learning process. And then 2, like, what should you do to ensure that you'll be better off for the next attempt? So by doing that kind of consistently, especially in the first month of the semester, tries to get students to understand how the learning process fits in, and then they should start benefiting from that process earlier. I think that's kind of key.
I have the benefit of hindsight, I guess, and asking, or in having done this style before, I ask at the end of the semester for students to write advice to the next set of students who take this class with me, and you know, how they would recommend they approach the grading system. And then I put those comments in the syllabus so that they'll say, you know, students who are successful in this course recommended that these things. And the students who give feedback will almost always say, get started on reassessments early. And for some reason, that means a lot more coming from students than it does from me. And I'll take it as long as I get students in reassessing.
So for in-class reassessments, so I'm combining several different questions for some of these. So for in-class reassessments, if you have students who don't need to do anything that's reassessed, what, do they just go? Are they done? Is there something for them to do?
So, I mean, for most of the semester, all the students will be doing something. But here and there, yeah, some of the top students, if they're done, yeah, they can go. That's how I do it, at least. I mean, actually, the extreme of that is towards the end of the semester, when students reach the cap for an A, say in the last week of the semester, they don't need a final, they're done. They have the A.
I often find that students have a hard time believing that. It's actually one of the really pleasant parts of a course where you can say, yes, you have an A. You're not going to lose it either. So if you have students, this is one of the questions I put off a little bit. If you have students who have disabilities or otherwise have necessary accommodations from one of your offices perhaps. How do you manage that, especially if they require extra time, for example, for assessments?
We don't have that at the Naval Academy, but when students are doing reassessments, I don't actually give them a time limit. So.
Yeah, I suppose I'm very similar as well. But for the in-class part, of course, that's kind of an issue. I suppose it's not that many students. I guess I just check in with them individually. In my experience, most of those students are fine, just taking the normal time. And if they need the extra time, I mean, sort of come back with me, sit in the conference room, take as long as you need. But it hasn't really been an issue.
Similar to what Jason said, if I kind of approach it on a student by student basis. If I do have a student who requires time and a half or double time, then I give the whole class that time. And I budget for that. And usually that works fine. And then throughout the semester, the student with a disability will often tell me, now I can't say this is always going to be true, but they will often tell me they don't need that much time. And so we can kind of speed some things up. But for equity reasons, I just decide to give everybody that same amount of time. And then when I have students reassess in the tutoring center, I do not require a time limit at all. So they show up anytime between the hours of noon and 10 p.m. and they can spend as much or as little time doing it as possible. Thank
you. So do any of you require students to do anything before they are allowed to reassess? You know, for example, to correct an original assessment, to reflect in some way? That may be a no.
Go ahead, Adelaide.
Yeah. Yes, I do. I mentioned that in order for students to qualify for a reassessment in the tutoring center, they have to write a reflection first. And I have very detailed requirements about what that reflection should involve. Usually it's taking the comments that I write on their quiz and finding the mistake, correcting the mistake, reflecting on the comments that I made, why their mistake was actually a mistake, what kind of mistake it was. Was it a logic error? Was it a computation error? Was it a conceptual error? I have this all detailed out in a syllabus, which I am going to share with Rachel Weir's suppository in a little bit. But it's all outlined for them, and they have to submit that to me at least a day before they, at least the day before they do a reassessment. And if they check off all the boxes that I require them to check off in those requirements, then they are allowed to reassess. If not, I send it back and ask them to redo the reflection, and they can reassess when it's finished. That kind of ties into this whole, you know, trying to get the students to be more self-regulated. Like, this is what people would do in the workforce. They don't always have someone standing over their shoulder saying, you need to do this and this and this and this in order to make it better. And so, so it's all in line with my general philosophy of trying to make students self-regulated learners.
I've definitely found something similar to that. Asking students to reflect first makes the reassessments more effective in the first place, and also has the effect of ensuring students know what it is that they need to focus on.
And it is something that Tom Mahoney and I have been collecting data on. We teach the same classes, or we've taught the same classes using the same standards, but Tom does not use the reflection requirement, and I do, and we're trying to see if that affects how many times students need to reattempt a standard before they actually pass. My conjecture is that the reflections will help them require fewer attempts, but we don't have enough data yet to make that claim.
There's a question about using verbal reassessment, so actually talking with a student or having them show you work on the fly. Have any of you used that?
I have not really. It's been mainly on paper assessments, but the experience of doing a correction is usually face-to-face. And it's a nice kind of like a chat about the material, and the student comes to a realization of kind of closing the loop on the problem. So I have enjoyed that a lot, but I haven't experienced oral assessments too much.
I have done that some as a way of that students have an option of assessing that way instead of doing a quiz. And I've also done one where a student would be in my office and doing practice problems at the board, and they would do a problem and explain it to me. And then I would say, okay, well, now you don't have to take the quiz because you just showed that you understand this. So, and they were surprised and very pleased.
I have given sometimes my students the option to choose in person or on paper, and they very much prefer on paper, but those who do the in-person one discover and start telling their classmates that they prefer, like, oh yeah, he sort of gives you hints, he talks to you, helps with it. I feel like I learn a ton from there. This is one of my favorite things about mastery grading, is how much more valuable office hour conversations can be. And that sometimes you can say, you know what, that was a great assessment. I can see it, you are good. So here's a big question. I believe all of us moved online in the middle of last semester. How did you change your reassessment methods when that happened?
I kept them mainly the same, I guess. I suppose I had students writing in Word. I used the homework system to come up with problems. I just did a 0, 1, 2, 3. I was using that semester. Since in particular for that stats class, I mentioned I finished the course material 2 weeks before. I didn't have that long to do, so it was mainly just reassessments, which was like a Word document that they uploaded. And I found it actually kind of nice. I can give really detailed feedback relatively quickly because I just type in a different font or something. So that's how I handled mine. Word problems when they needed to explain stuff, and then maybe online homework system if the answer was just a number.
So my calculus class this spring was not, I wasn't using this, but I was teaching an abstract algebra class where I was using something similar to the intro to proof one that I talked about. And for that, it was again, the students were doing problems and they were presenting, but instead of presenting in the classroom, they were presenting on Zoom and showing the work. So it worked out to be almost identical actually, which was nice.
I didn't change much either. I instead of submitting my the reattempts that students requested, instead of submitting them to the math tutoring lab, I actually made them quizzes on Canvas and then would close them until Thursdays from the normal time that I allowed them to take them. And so Canvas would automatically open it up. It would be open from noon to 10. On Thursdays, and then they could pop in anytime and take that quiz.
So we have, actually, I wanted to also say one of the things that did not cause me trouble in the big online pivot was mastery grading. It more or less continued the same way as many of our panelists have said. It was one of the bright spots in all of that. So we have a question that's come up many times here. Can students have equal opportunity to reassess material from near the end of the semester versus at the beginning, just in terms of sheer amount? And a related question, what if you are doing multiple regular testing days? Do the students only have 1 or 2 attempts total for things that came at the end of the semester then?
I see, I suppose naturally at the end, right, if you finish the last standard, right, closer to the end of the semester, right, naturally there'll be less time. So one way is I try to finish the last topic, at least a week before the semester, the last class of the semester, so that you can at least get 1 or 2 attempts in before the final. So yeah, maybe the last 1 or 2 perhaps are a little squeezed. At the same time, don't usually require students to get every single standard right for an A. There's a little bit of wiggle room in there. So the students that are not going for an A, I mean, they can even just ignore it at the end, I suppose.
Yes, all of that, same thing for me.
Same. I think also towards the end of the semester, I will sometimes just look at how in general the class is doing, and if I feel like I would like to increase the number of attempts each week, and I can handle that increase, then I will do that. But that it's really up to how in general how the class is doing and how I feel about increasing the workload on all of us. So.
It definitely requires careful planning and thinking ahead. I would say that's something anyone thinking about starting mastery grading for the first time needs to be thinking about is how do things end, right? What happens at the end of the semester? I have sometimes given students a one free convince me reassessment where they can say, I want to reassess this thing, and they have to make up their own way of showing me that they've demonstrated mastery of one specific thing. That's been kind of fun in many cases because they really care about it and want to do it as well as they can. We have a question. I am not sure if any of our panelists can directly answer this, but the question is, do you have suggestions for reassessment in very large classes? So the example is up to 300 students, no TAs.
I think if you're in that situation, you would have to be pretty clear about what are the things that you really, really want to how many standards do you really want to have? So for instance, my colleague's teaching a pre-calculus class that has 105 standards. And then I've heard of other people who are teaching, like, let's do like 5 or 6 standards. So I think if I was teaching a huge course, I would want to say, okay, what are the 5 or 6 things that I want to make sure, and then, sort of limit, and then think really carefully about what product you want that you're going to be grading hundreds of. Yeah.
Do you mean like assessing for a topic versus an individual problem? Like, what are the top 5, 6 topics that I would like to assess? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or what are the 5 or 6 things that I want to make sure that people get out of this course? I don't know whether that's always topics, but yeah.
I would definitely strongly recommend going with a purely doing reassessments on regular exams or quizzes in class as opposed to office hours or revising previous material. This is one of those divisions that I think I'm seeing a little bit of this in the Q&A also is worth restating, that there's revising of previous work, which often comes with some reflective cover page or something. And there's reassessing a standard. So there's trying a new problem or a new assessment of a standard that may not be the same as the assessment they tried the first time. And what I'm suggesting here is that do reassessments in the sense of a new quiz or a new exam with some of the same standards as a previous one. And then if they retry one of the previous one or one that has already been done on a previous exam, that's a reassessment. Their new grade counts. Does that, panelists, does that agree? Do you understand what I mean there?
Yeah.
Sure.
I should say that I kind of conflate the two. I guess that I'm the one causing the confusion here. In my calculus classes, they can only pass standards off of quizzes. And so if they do not pass a quiz, then they have to do the revision reflection and correct. And part of that revision reflection is to correct the problem that they missed on the quiz. And then they turn that into me. If it matches all the specifications that I required for the reflection, then they are allowed to reattempt a new quiz on the same topic in the reassessment hours that are available. In the upper level classes, when I do it though, for proofs, I just ask them to purely revise the proof that they originally turned in.
And I think that choice is an important one to think about. And we've heard the phrase that a conceptual problem becomes procedural on revision, which may or may not always be true, but it's something to think about if you're going to allow a revision versus a reassessment in a new way, that there's a consequence about how that might play out.
And for me in calculus, there's a distinction between something that's going to be a quiz, like, compute these derivatives. That would be something that's definitely going to be a reassessment for me. I'm going to give a new quiz with a new batch of derivatives. But for something like explain to me where the definition of the derivative comes from, how it's related to slope, why that h is going to 0, that's something that I would ask them to revise, because it's not like there's another question about that.
So here's a very interesting question. I'm going to read it in its entirety from the Q&A. So one reason for me to move to mastery-based grading is to squash the feeling of hopelessness that students get at some point, usually early on in the semester, when they determine that they no longer have a chance to earn the grade they wanted. And my fear with limiting reattempts is that it doesn't address this issue, at least not as well as I would like. What has your experience been with students in this regard? So of limiting reattempts so that at some point they are effectively closed out of being able to succeed on this.
I wouldn't necessarily say things are so limited, even with the limits that I was talking about, because doing things mostly in class, students see almost all the problems 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So I don't necessarily think there's an issue with them not having enough opportunities. But I think early on, I really like that example of having the student grades of like 100, 40, 100, where they feel like they can't get out of that hole of having that 40%. So I mean, having that conversation early on, I think shifts the mindset. That's probably good for students to have.
I do calculate the limits that I put on reattempts based off of, you know, their ability to still pass the class if they take advantage of those or choose not to. And keep in mind here that in my system, I do allow them 1 attempt per week until after they pass their gateway exam, and then they can take as many as they want each week, as long as as long as it's reasonable. I do put an upper limit on it, but it's oral, and I tell them how many I will allow them. But the goal is to try to get them to pass that gateway exam. And then I do offer other exams throughout the semester, which is just a collection of all of the different quizzes, and they can attempt as many as they want to. So the limits that I put on are still calculated in a way that they can still pass the class if they do some minimal effort. If they only show up for those exams where they can try as many as they want to, they could technically still pass the class, but it's unlikely, and I do warn them of that. So I think it all depends on how many standards you have, and calculating the limits that you put on there that is reasonable for both the student and for you.
I find that it delays the hopelessness, so that I usually happens for 1 or 2 students a given semester, where it's like, now we're down to the last week and they're realizing I need to pass this many quizzes in order to pass the class. And those things can get very, very uncomfortable. Yeah, so I was thinking about one particular student who, you know, was in tears at the end because she couldn't pass the last quiz that she needed to get the grade that she wanted. But then, you know, the next semester when I saw her, she, you know, ran up to me and gave me a hug. So I felt better about that. But yeah, I think it is a double-edged sword that way, I think. So.
And I think it's going to be that way for as long as we in education assign grades. Like having a cutoff is going to be painful for some students. But, you know, again, I guess I have benefited from the fact that this effective failure stuff that I've done in my class kind of tells them, like, failure is not the end. And even if you fail a class, that doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't capable of succeeding in it later. And so instilling that sort of mindset in them is important for them to succeed not only in their classes eventually, whether it's yours or another one, but in life in general. That's just a good life mindset to have.
I absolutely agree, Adelaide and Amy. I've said it a few times now that I think mastery grading makes office hour visits more valuable. It doesn't mean that it makes them easier, and sometimes there are still difficult conversations with students, but they're at least more focused, difficult conversations. And I'd encourage anyone thinking about these sorts of issues to think to have a way to look out for students who aren't taking advantage of reassessments in whatever way you're offering them. Students who are, you know, keep trying something and are not making headway, that it's important to intervene and talk with them and sort of find out what's going on, and maybe discuss some study skills perhaps, or have that kind of difficult conversation Adelaide was just talking about, that, yeah, there's a point at which you cannot pass. It pushes it much later, as Amy had said, but that there is still that point and they need to be aware of it. So we're very close to the end here, actually. And so I want to ask what I think might be the last question here. Have any of you done assessments that are or reassessments, excuse me, that are of things that aren't really in the quiz or exam style? So I think when we're saying quiz and exam, we mean a quiz being a relatively short in-class assessment and an exam being a long in-class assessment that usually covers more material. Have you dealt with reassessments of other things entirely? For example, a homework assignment or some other type of assessment?
I think I've talked about that a little bit in, having students present problems and that they can get credit for something like that. And I did also, one semester, I had some students who really needed to do a reassessment and there was no time that we could meet. And so I said, okay, make a video of yourself explaining this and send that to me. And that worked okay. And I've done writing assignments, and I'm really thinking a lot about what to do for online for the fall, about what I can do, because I don't think that having a timed quote unquote in-class exam, I just don't think that's going to work very well. And so thinking about what other things I can do next semester, and it's going to involve a lot more writing and explaining, I think. So.
Something that I find is nice, especially if you're careful in how you write your grade requirements. Instead of saying you have to demonstrate mastery this many times on a quiz or on an exam, is just you must demonstrate mastery this many times. And you can find additional opportunities to open up if you need them, such as Amy's, make me a video and tell me about it. Aha, there's a demonstration of mastery. It counts. Did anyone else want to address that, reassessments of different types of assignments?
I've done a reassessment of homework problems in proof-based courses. Basically, they submit it the first time. I give them feedback. Either it's passed already or not. If it hasn't, I send it back with comments, and they have to revise it and resubmit it. So that's the form of reassessment for those types of classes. And then for their entire grade, they'll have to have done that, a certain number of times for homework problems and meet those qualifications. But the revision process that takes place is a form of reassessment in that sense.
Absolutely. So we are just about at the end right here. So first I want to thank our panelists very much for giving us all of their advice. This is a big topic. It's one that I know a lot of people are very concerned about, and thank you for your help. For everybody else, I want to say this is something that you probably want to put on more limits, be a little more restrictive than you think your first time out in mastery grading, and then find ways to make it fit you better. So we have a half-hour break and then another set of parallel panels, 3 this time, that you can choose from. And so I hope we'll see you there.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you all.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out if you have questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Well done, everybody. Well done, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. This is a tough topic. There's a lot to think about.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely giving me a lot to think about.
I think your point at the end, David, about setting more restrictions and then loosening them as you go is something that I wanted to make sure that I highlighted, but I don't think I did it quite as eloquently as you did at the end. Like I put a ton of restrictions on, and then we'll lift them as